Welcome to another episode of the Doctors Building Wealth podcast. I'm your host, Leti, and today I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. I'm going to answer a question we oftentimes get in our courses and in our communities about properties and what kind of property to start buying first as an investment property. So the question is, what type of property should I buy first? Should I buy a short-term rental? Should I buy a long-term rental? What's the best place for me to start if I'm going to start investing in real estate? So this is a really great question because what it really shows is people are unsure where to start. They understand there's long-term rentals, and long-term rentals have a length of stay of 8 days or more by the IRS. But what it really is oftentimes where it has tenants for 12 months at a time. And then there are short-term rentals, which are rentals where people usually guests, we call them guests, stay short periods of time, oftentimes just a couple of days. The IRS definition of a short-term rental is 7 days or less, which is important for tax reasons. That's why I make sure that I bring that up. And what's awesome about each of them is they each have upsides and they each have downsides. And people are generally aware of them, the upsides and the downsides, when they ask this question. And oftentimes they ask this question because they're very motivated about taxes. So briefly, short-term rentals, it's much easier to access the tax savings to be able to shelter your W-2, 1099, or business income. And that's because with short-term rentals, there's something we call the short-term rental tax loophole, where you can buy one short-term rental and you want to meet criteria for material participation, which in our community, people often do. They do 100 hours in the calendar year and more than anyone else. And that more than anyone else is important to know because it means that you're doing more hours than the contractor, than the property manager. And so what this oftentimes will look like in our community is, let's say you buy a short-term rental and it's August or September. You'll set it up and you'll make sure you're getting the 100 hours plus by, going and negotiating and doing due diligence and setting up your rental. And maybe you do a direct booking website. And maybe you even decide to self-manage it so that you don't have that problem of, hey, did I do more hours than the cleaner? Did I do more hours than a property manager this year? And maybe you decide to self-manage it just through the end of the year. And then at the end of the year, you've claimed bonus depreciation. So you've claimed a lot of the tax benefits of the short-term rental in year one instead of spreading them out over time. And then in that case, year two, oftentimes people will hand it over to a property manager and become a passive investor. Well, what that allows you to do, if you do meet criteria for material participation the first year and you do 100 hours and more than anyone else, is all of your losses on that property become losses that can shelter W-2, 1099, or business income. And those losses can be quite significant, especially if you use bonus depreciation, which is you shift a lot of those losses that you are able to write off as depreciation, which is basically the government sees your building as losing value every year. You're able to write off those losses year one instead of spreading them out over time. And so usually what you get is a fairly significant write-off off your taxes in year one. That's called a paper loss. It's not a real loss. Like you can still have made money on your property. You can still have cash flow, but on your taxes, it looks like you're losing money because of depreciation. So oftentimes what we'll see is that first year, a person's writing off that bonus depreciation. They're writing off maybe furniture that they had to buy for the property. Maybe they did have to do some light rehab, obviously keeping in mind that they wanted to do more hours than the contractor. And so they're writing off some of those rehab costs, and that's creating a loss. And this loss is what we consider to be an active loss, meaning that it can shelter active income like W-2 income, 1099 income, or business income. And so for the dual physician couple or the couple where both people are working full time and they really want to be able to access the tax savings of real estate, short-term rental can be much easier to do because I just described the process of tapping into the short-term rental tax loophole versus a long-term rental where you have to get real estate professional status to be able to shelter W-2 or 1099 or business income. And real estate professional status for long-term rentals means that you're going out and you're doing real estate more than anything else. So it's really challenging to do as a full-time doctor. And you also have to do over 750 hours a year in real estate, which is a lot more than just buying one short-term rental and doing 100 hours on that short-term rental and more than anyone else. So when people come and ask us this question, should I buy a short-term rental? Should I buy a long-term rental first? Part of what's often driving the story behind it is like thinking about the tax savings and understanding that short-term rentals oftentimes will have a higher cash-on-cash return, meaning they'll give you a higher return But on the downside of short-term rentals, they're often higher risk, especially because they're single-family homes, which can go up and down with market value. And they're also more work, right? Because you have a lot of tenant turnover, especially if you're self-managing, that's more work versus a long-term rental, which can have, a tenant stay for 12 months and you can have a property manager. And over time, everybody needs a house to live in, right? Or a home to live in. They don't necessarily need a vacation property and they don't necessarily need a vacation. And so long-term rentals definitely have a lower risk, but also you have generally, not always, but generally you get lower returns, lower cash and cash returns, lower monthly cash flow from a short-term rental versus a long-term rental. And so people are just trying to decide what to do. So what's the right answer? Well, there's no right answer. And yeah, I think that's probably not surprising to you. I think part of it depends on your goals. So if you came to me and you're like, hey, my main goal is to save on taxes and I'm a dual physician couple and nobody's gonna be cutting back, well, then it makes sense to go with a short-term rental. Or if you say, hey, my main goal is to build a portfolio of really stable long-term investments that are low risk over time, well, then maybe you're going to build a portfolio of long-term rentals. But oftentimes what happens in our community is people take zero to freedom. They have skills to do short-term rentals, long-term rentals, midterm rentals, even medical office buildings, and they end up holding a portfolio that includes multiple types of properties, commercial properties, for example. So it's really, this whole question boils down to which type of property should I buy first? Because when you think about the upsides and downsides of long-term rentals versus short-term rentals, each has upsides, each has downsides. And what you're probably going to find is that you want to diversify your portfolio over time and take advantage of the upsides of each type while balancing the downsides of each one. Because you can imagine if you had just a portfolio of $1 million short-term rentals, well, you might have some really great years with really high cash on cash returns. But you're probably working a little bit harder and you're definitely having more risk. And if we go into a recession and less people take vacation, if your $1 million short-term rentals are in vacation areas, you might get hit and it might actually reduce your income significantly. Meanwhile, if you've gotten to access all the tax savings very, very easily, you've sheltered a lot of W-2 income, you've gotten that check back from the IRS, and you're really happy anyway, but maybe you're getting a little bit less cash flow now versus if you had built a portfolio that had those short-term rentals, but maybe had a few less and had some long-term rentals in there. Now you've got that stability of being able to make it through tough times because everybody needs a home. You have those renters staying in long-term, so you have that monthly cash flow instead of as many ups and downs. And one of the other benefits of long-term rentals is if you can get multiple units in the same building, like you get a multifamily property. First of all, one of the really great things is the value of that property is based on the cash flow it produces. So if you increase the cash flow, it's a lot more reliable way to force appreciation or increase the value of that property. And it's a lot less reliant on market fluctuations than a single family home or like a short-term rental. And so even if the market's changing with your properties with real estate, you have that stability of having those long-term rentals, having the diversification of long-term rentals where, you have 10 units under a single roof and maybe one unit's empty while you're still cash flowing. So you have a lot more diversification and a lot more reduced costs when you have 10 apartments under a single roof. It's a lot more efficient than if you just have one single family home. So again, upsides and downsides of long-term rentals and short-term rentals. In our community, a lot of people who are dual physician, full-time workers will choose short-term rentals first. But what we usually find is that people will build a portfolio that's diversified across multiple types of properties. Medical office is a really exciting one, which we've had other podcasts talking about the tax benefits of medical office buildings. And we're seeing more and more people in our community go and, start their own practices and use that to be able to shelter the office building, to be able to shelter their medical practice income. So another thing to really think about. But in our community, people tend to build portfolios that are more diversified, that are going to be around for the long haul and produce cash flow, but also reduce risk. So that's the answer to this question of, should I buy a long-term rental? Should I buy a short-term rental? Which one's best for me? The answer is, look at your goals and make sure whatever you're doing is aligned with your goals, your cash flow goals. And also think about, really, you're buying your first property, but your portfolio over time, when you zoom out 5 years from now, is probably going to have both. So it's not an and or answer. It's not an or answer. It's an and answer, right? Which do I buy first? And I'm going to make sure to buy other types of properties to diversify my portfolio. Okay, well, hopefully you enjoyed this episode, which is just answering a simple question. If you're enjoying Doctors Building Wealth, make sure to subscribe, share it with a friend who's maybe interested in real estate investing and building another source of income outside of their day job, outside of medicine, so they can live a life they love, because that's what we're here and that's what we're talking about. And leave us a review. Thanks for joining us.